Welcome to this video lesson on the Civil Rights Movement. This lesson is going to go over people, laws, policies, and events that took place during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s while African Americans fought for their civil rights. The first step in the Civil Rights Movement was the desegregation of the armed forces by President Harry Truman in 1947. This helped the Civil Rights Movement move forward with a lot of momentum in the 1950s and 60s. Prior to this, units in the U.S. military were segregated. There were black units and white units. After Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces, they were integrated. Effects of segregation include separate education facilities and resources. If you remember, African American children are going to schools without as many resources and are more run down than the schools attended by white children. Separate public facilities, including restaurants, stores, public transportation. Those would be some examples. And social isolation of the races. They can't interact with each other in social settings. If there's a community event, there would be a black one and a white one. There are many civil rights leaders, but some that we are going to focus on are Martin Luther King Jr. He is most famous for his March on Washington and his I Have a Dream speech. At the end of this video, I'm going to ask that you watch the March on Washington newsreel with the speech. He's a very powerful public speaker, and he rallies people and brings people together to protest segregation and discrimination. The Freedom Riders are a group of black and white, young and old, men and women, people who rode buses together to protest segregation. The buses had been desegregated. However, the people in southern states were not following the law. And so this group of people rode the buses together to try to get the laws to be enforced. They were beaten many times, and they had to work very hard to try to achieve their goals. It was very dangerous. You're going to learn more about them in the must-do activity. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in the front of a bus when she was tired after working one day. When the buses were segregated, African Americans had to sit in the back, and the white people got to sit in the front. Her refusal to give up her seat sparked or began the Montgomery bus boycott, in which many African Americans and whites protested the segregation of buses by walking or getting rides to and from work and other activities they needed. They spent an entire year not riding the buses and finally forced the bus system to desegregate. The NAACP, which W.E.B. Du Bois began in the early 1900s, is an organization that works towards equal rights for all citizens. All of these civil rights leaders used various strategies and organized protest to try to achieve their goal and bring attention to their cause. They used sit-ins, which literally means that you are sitting in a place until you are served or forcibly removed. The most famous one would be in Greensboro at Woolworth's lunch counter. Several African Americans entered and sat at the counter, which was for whites only, and they sat there until they were removed by law enforcement. The Freedom Riders were the group of men and women, white and black people, who rode buses through the South to try to get desegregation enforced. They would march. The March on Washington is the most famous, in which Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, and finally boycotts, the most famous of which is the Montgomery bus boycott, where people refused to ride the buses for a year in order to protest segregation. Due to the efforts of the civil rights leaders and the civil rights movement and many, many others who helped, there was some legislation passed. If you remember, Plessy versus Ferguson, we learned about that Supreme Court case at the beginning of the year. They said separate but equal is okay. Unfortunately, things weren't really equal, but they were separate. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education desegregated the public schools. There was a young girl who lived in Kansas who was forced to go to a black-only school that was really far away from her house, and the whites-only school was much closer. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Brown versus the Board of Education is the Supreme Court case that desegregated public schools. The Little Rock Nine is a group of 9 African American students who had to be escorted by the U.S. National Guard so that they could safely attend school in Arkansas once the schools are desegregated. 2 other important laws from this time period are the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation in public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices, such as you have to take a reading test before you can vote, or other laws that were illegal for people who wanted to be able to vote. Now on your graphic organizer, I would like you to highlight which organized protest strategy do you think would be most effective? And then which of the effects of segregation do you think would affect the most people? So take a moment and please highlight that on your notes on the graphic organizer. And I want to point out to you that there's still many civil rights issues today, and the Martin Luther King Jr. received a memorial on the National Mall in the early 2000s. You can see a picture of that memorial here on the National Mall. Hopefully some of you have seen it. Finally, I'm going to play for you the newsreel of the March on Washington so that you can see that. So please watch this through to the end and then move on to the must-do activities. Make sure your graphic organizer is completed and attached to the proper assignment in Google Classroom.
Just 100 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, 200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come by train, they come by bus and by air. They come from the north, the south, the east, and west. They come united in one cause, to urge Congress to pass a civil rights bill to end forever the blight of racial inequity. This great throng with a cause gathers on the mall that stretches from the Washington Monument toward the Capitol. From the break of dawn, they filter into the city. By 9:30, it is estimated that 40,000 had assembled. But it's more like a Sunday outing as they form into groups and discuss the day quietly. They are scheduled to move to the Lincoln Memorial at noon to hear the top leaders of the movement. Those leaders, at the moment, are conferring on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, pointing up the aims of the rally. By 11:30, there are more than 200,000 thronging the mall, a crowd that is bigger than the most optimistic forecasts. Now there's a growing animation. It seems as if the demonstrators were finding strength in each other, had discovered their cause was a bond. The crowd became impatient to get started, and they moved toward the Lincoln Memorial before the scheduled hour. They move with good humor, laughter, and song. Few realize that in a sense they are participants in an historical day. It will become part of the American scene that today's gathering is the largest in Washington's history. The men who organized the rally walk with springing steps toward the speaker stand. On the left, Roy Wilkins with A. Philip Randolph. They have fought their fight all of their adult lives. In the van is Martin Luther King, who has been jailed 12 times on racial issues. Others on hand include Walter Reuther, head of the auto workers. Authorities were fearful fearful of disorders, and there were 5,000 uniformed men on duty. They had little to do but keep dissident groups away from the rally. Arrests in Washington were below normal. Police attribute this to the fact that for the first time in 30 years, you couldn't even buy a beer in Washington. The civil rights marchers needed no stimulants like that. They provided their own, with songs that ranged from the sacred to the hillbilly, but with the one recurring theme, the cause of 20 million Negroes. The crowd assembled around the reflecting pool before the Lincoln Memorial occupies every inch on the lawns and under the trees, and there's a great swell of cheers to welcome Martin Luther King to the speaker's podium, a man who stands as a symbol of all they are fighting for. Mr. King and the other leaders are to go to the White House, where the president said that everyone must be impressed with the demonstration of the throng's faith and confidence in our democratic form of government. However, he warned, there's a long fight ahead in Congress. The theme, the keynote, the thought uppermost in minds of all here today is best set forth by Dr. King. He sums up a day the Capitol will long remember.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood? I have a dream.
Washington, D.C., 1963. Democracy Speaks.